All right, we're still where? What book? Genesis. Lord willing, we'll get through Genesis today. We'll finish it up. This particular lesson is now, we're on a, as you see, let's move over here a little bit. Let's move on down. Lesson 4D. Did I get the right one? 4D, and I said 4. No, 4E. I'm sorry, I didn't change the bottom of 4E. But I didn't change the bottom of it. But it's 4E we're on. So this lesson has really been divided up a little bit more to learn more things. You've seen this before. We already talked about this real short briefly here. We've talked about this, about Abraham and Sarah. We dealt with this section I added in here myself about God's visitation and talking dealing with Hagar and Abraham and Sarah and the events in their lives and what was impacting in their lives with God's visitation with them. We've dealt with Isaac. We've talked with Jacob. Last week we dealt with Jacob and a little bit, touched barely on Joseph last week. So we're going to pick up today, Lord willing, finishing off with the life of Joseph here. We're going to touch on this morning, what the plan is this morning. I've used this before, the same opening about, God, the Old Testament, how important. Because I bring this up because some people don't think the Old Testament is important. They don't, I don't want to read the Old Testament. That's the past, and I don't want to read all that. But it is very important. It's very essential to know something about the Old Testament. And I know, we all know, when you get the Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, and all these names are listed there. But you know what? They're there. And they're where? They're in the Word of God. And God wanted those names in there, And we have a tendency, I don't know how to pronounce that, so let me just skip this whole chapter. But as you go through, and I'm going to say this again probably later when we get to that, if you go through some of those names, you're going to say, I've seen that name somewhere else in the Scriptures. And you'll start seeing that tie back sometimes as you go through. So most importantly, those names, everyone is important. It is God's Word. So it's there for a reason for us. But overall, the Old Testament explains these things as you see here. It explains how God made Abraham's descendants into a great nation. We talked about that before. I don't know if you remember. The book of Genesis, when we get to the time of the flood, what was happening right after the flood? What happened after the flood? Big event. Tower of Babel. And what was happening there? I'm sorry? They were trying to reach up to heaven. They did not do what they were supposed to do, right? They did not go out. They were trying to stay together and found some way to stay together because they all spoke the same language. But then the Lord changed that up, so they had to speak different languages, of course. So switch that up. Then after that, you start seeing about the introduction of Abraham. And of course, with Abraham begins the nation Israel, starting from there, okay? So we talked about this, dealing with Abraham's descendants, with Isaac. We talked about him. We talked about Jacob, of course, some of these things in Jacob's life, what we touched on previously. His birthright, the deception that took place between Jacob and who? Esau, his brother. Okay, brother Esau was older. Between those two, what took place there. And of course, the flight of Jacob, how Jacob had to flee as well. Because of his brother was going to do what? Hug him and say, hey, I'm glad for you and all that. You got the blessings. He was intent on killing his brother. So Jacob had to leave and go to Haran. And with that, going to Haran, how did that work out going to Haran? I mean, as far as packing up his bags and going to Haran, but also what was going along with that? What was the sending, I guess, package with that? What was looking for a wife? Because Rebecca convinced her husband, hey, Jacob needs to go find a wife, but not around here, so let's send him on back, Jacob, I mean, you think about it, she was a little bit manipulator on some things here. But she never saw him again, did she? Never saw her son again. Because once he went to Haran. Okay. Of course, when he got to Haran, when Jacob got there, what happened with him? Well, he found a wife. It didn't come easy, did it? He had to do some extra work for her, didn't he? Yeah, wasn't easy finding a wife. Found her, but it took longer to get her, right? Got a taste of his own medicine. Of the deception that he had done, he also got deceived as well. But the Lord blessed him anyways. Of course, he had a wife, he had Leah, and then he had Rachel. And they had many children, of course, that we shared with you. Okay. Then we talked about Joseph. Joseph was the dreamer. And that's who we're talking about, mostly about today. Joseph the dreamer, of course. And dreamer, and he was a dreamer. He was also what? He was a prisoner, and he eventually became the head, prime minister, if you want to call it, of Egypt. In a 13-year period of time of being sold into slavery, by the time he became the prime minister. How would you like that kind of career path? Think, man, I'm down the low end of this totem pole here, but then 13 years, I'm top man here. But it was all by how was it done? Done by the Lord's hand. The Lord's guidance through his whole life and all that, you know. And we'll see that as we go through. He was a trusted prisoner here, as you see. We talked about it. Joseph was in prison, and if you want it, I just got it written down here, Genesis chapter 39. So we're going to pick up, we're really going to go through 40, go fast through that route because there's 10 chapters, 11 chapters going through. But in chapter 39, in verse 21, it says, with Joseph, this is verse 20, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Why was he put into prison? What did you do wrong? Nothing. He was innocent. But he was put in prison because the wife who blamed him for something he didn't do. But he's put in prison. Still having his godly character about him. Still cast into prison. But look in verse 21. But it says, but the Lord was with Joseph and shewed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Anything that Joseph was involved in, the Lord made it to prosper. Isn't that pretty cool? You think about it? That's pretty great for a guy, young guy, 17, 18 years old. We don't know how long he was in the house there before the wife was chasing him around. Maybe 18, I don't know. But when he's put in prison. But he's in prison here, and yet the Lord is blessing him and taking care of him. And his hand is on him in all of this. And I think it's interesting about Joseph. You see this, if you go through with Joseph's life, which you should see this, Joseph doesn't complain about God. Of all the things he goes through, he doesn't complain about anything. How many of us are like that? How many of us don't complain? We have a tendency probably to complain, oh, why me, Lord? Why does this happen to me in my life? Why does this got to be me? I'm doing the right things, and why is this happening to me? But Joseph didn't do that. And you'll see as you go through this in his life, you haven't already seen this already. So while he's there, he tells he interprets the dream in chapter 40. In chapter 40, and the chief butler and the chief baker both have dreams the same night. And so they come and they're worried about this. So if you have chapter 40, down here in verse 5, and they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which was bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and he looked upon them, and they were very sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of this Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, and I pray you. What I'm trying to get to is what Joseph said here. It's up to God. God is the one who can give the interpretation. He always gave God the glory in everything in his life. No matter what, he still gave God the glory. I want you to point that out to you. So I'm going to sum up this dream. So the dream is the butler has a dream and the baker has a dream. So what was the results of the butler's dream when Joseph talks to him? He hears the dream. Let's go on down here in verse 12. And Joseph said unto him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. And within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place, and thou shalt be delivered Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and shew kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and there also was I done nothing. I have done nothing that should have put me in the dungeon. So he talks to the chief butler and explains to him what? This dream indicates 3 days. In 3 days, you're going to be where? Mr. Butler, where are you going to be at? Back on the job again. Back serving Pharaoh. You're going to be back there. So when you do that, remember me. Remember me, this guy, there's a Hebrew who was put as a slave here. I've done nothing wrong. So sitting there in the same cell is who? The baker. So the baker said, hey, that sounds pretty good, don't it? So he interprets the baker's dream. And when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head. You know, he's thinking, hey, 3 and 3, that must be good stuff here. And in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said this in the interpretation thereof, the 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat the flesh from off thee. Can you imagine the countenance of the baker hearing this, not hearing good news? And can you also imagine these 2 guys knowing that in 3 days, what this young slave told them is going to come about? In 3 days, it does come about. I just can't fathom what they were thinking through their minds. I could see the chief butler, hey, man, I got something good to look for. But the baker's got what? It's not looking good. And he's hoping, I hope this guy is not told, I hope this interpretation is not what he says it is. But in 3 days, it does take place. The butler is restored to power, back to his position. And of course, the baker is hung. He loses his life. So the butler's back in in chapter 41. You'll see in chapter 41, he remembers Joseph, but it's not the same day he's released, is it? It's 2 years later. 2 years later, and if you see in chapter 41, verse 1, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat flesh, and they fed in a meadow, and behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, till ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kind upon the brink of the river, and ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and the fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke. That's an amazing dream to even have. I'm not going to read all of this part of the dream because I got a lot of territory to cover. But to have these 2 dreams that he has here, and he sees what? He sees one that says, they got these fat cows, and you got these little skinny cows come along and eat the fat cows up. And says, that would be bewildering anyway, just to think of. But he has this dream. Of course, he asks his guys who are smart in his kingdom, what's the interpretation? Tell me what it is. You're smart, tell me what it is. Nobody could think of an answer, could they? To come up to the Pharaoh. You got to realize in Egypt was one of the most powerful kingdoms at the time. He was the most powerful man ever around at the time for the Egyptians. The Pharaoh was. But if you look down in verse 9, then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker, and we dreamed a dream in one night. I and he, and we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. Verse 12, and there was there with us a young man, a Hebrew servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto my office, and him be hanged. 2 years later, in God's timing, in God's plan, Joseph was then talked about. You think about it. When that butler was released 2 years earlier, the butler forgot. But by God's design, allow it to be that way till this important time to take place. All in God's timing. When things happen in our lives, we got to realize we got to be according to God's timing, relying on Him and trusting Him when things take place. Can you imagine when Joseph says, the day after the butler's been released, the next day, the next week. So maybe I'll hear something soon. And it goes on for 2 years not hearing anything at all. Yes, Terry?
Joseph was the main character that God was using to bring Israel into Egypt. And I think through all his trials and everything, I think his focus that got him through everything was his faith, that he was playing a part, and he was trying to wait on the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to his forefathers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same today. Everything you go through, anything you've got to wait on, you just, to me, it's just a lot easier if you just say, okay, Lord, your will, your time and your will.
And we walk by faith. We're to walk by faith. Bottom line. I'm meant to get to this point. We'll get there. But here, so he does interpret Pharaoh's dream for him and explains to Pharaoh about what he saw was that in 7 years was what? Going to be plenty. But then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And the famine is going to be so severe, you wouldn't even know there was any years of plenty that ever took place. It's going to be so bad. And with telling that to Pharaoh, Joseph also says to him, go down in verse 30. And now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. And let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And he goes on to explain to him, you need to find somebody who can lead this up and get those, while you got plenty of years and the abundance, take part of that and store it away, because you're going to need it when the famine takes place. Of course, who does Pharaoh choose? Joseph. The guy who interpreted the dreams, the guy he realizes that God's with him. And he says down there, and the thing was good in verse 37, in the eyes of Pharaoh, in the eyes of his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servant, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And he chose Joseph to be the man. Think about this young guy who was, by this time he's 30 years old. I can't remember what passage that was. I know in 30, says somewhere he was 30 years old when he became, verse 46, and Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. By this time, 30 years old, he's appointed kind of like the prime minister of Egypt and given that power to do what? To collect and set up the means of collecting surplus food that they would have. So the years of abundance, in chapter 41, there's years of abundance, but then it gets to be the years of the famine kick in. And when the years of famine kick in, then it affects everybody else. It affects the rest of the world. It's affecting them. It's affecting, of course, it's affecting Joseph's family back in Canaan. So in chapter 42 is the family reunion. Chapter 42, you'll see, I got here about the plenteous and the years of famine taking place. So in chapter 42, we're going to pick up in there the family. I'm going to go through this best I can for this, but in chapter 42, Joseph's brothers arrive for food. They're sent there to go. They've heard in chapter 42. Now when Jacob saw that, chapter 42, verse 1, now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said unto his sons, why do ye look upon one upon the other? And he said, behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren, for he said, lest peradventure his mischiefs befall him. And the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he was, it was told that sold all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And he said unto them, whence come ye? Are ye from the land? And they said, we are from the land of Canaan to buy food. Interesting that, of course, Joseph knows his brothers. After all these years, he knows who his brothers are. He knows. But what was the prophecy many years ago when the dreamer gave the dream? When Joseph was the dreamer, what was the dream? What was the prophecy? his family, his brothers and his family would bow down to him. And they did it right off the bat, didn't they, Don? These brothers right here. It's not the only time they do it, but it's the first time they do it, that they bow down to him. Fulfill that. And they said, and you imagine when he was a young guy, and before he was put into slavery, they thought, there's no way this is ever going to happen. You're crazy. No matter what people think, you're crazy. And God's plan is going to happen the way he wants it to be. So going on down through here, of course, while they're here, he gives them the food, and they talk about having brethren. And Joseph claims that they're spies. He's trying to check them out, really. And he knows who they are, but he's just messing with them, I guess, in a way. I want to say this. And they all say in verse 10, and they said unto verse 9, and Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them, and said unto them, Ye are spies to seek the nakedness of the land. Ye are come. And they said unto him, Nay, my Lord, but to buy food are thy servants come, and we all are one man's sons, and we are true men. The servants are no spies. And in process of time, he eventually does what? He takes one of them, puts them in prison, and tells them to go back and to get who? The other brother. His youngest brother, Benjamin. To go get his youngest brother back. Not that they know that, but go get him and bring him back with them. So they go back in chapter 43. They go back and they tell their dad, and their dad's like, he's not too keen on letting Benjamin go, of course. In chapter 43, Jacob finally lets Benjamin go back to Egypt with him. In chapter 43 and verse 13, you'll jump down there. Let's go to verse 10. For except we had lingered, surely now we had returned this second time. And their father Israel said unto them, If it must be so now, do this, take of the best fruits of the land in your vessels, and carry down the man a present, a little balm and a little honey, spices and myrrh and nuts and almonds. And take double money in your hand, and the money that was brought again into the mouth of your sack, and carried again in your hand. Peradventure it was an oversight. Take also your brother, and arise and to go again unto the man. And God Almighty give you mercy before the man, and that he may send away your other brother. And who was the other brother? Was Simeon, the one he had. And Benjamin, if I be bereaved my children, I am bereaved. So they go back to Egypt. They take Benjamin back with them. They take double money back to buy the money they had before, the money they need to buy, and they go back there. So they go back there, of course. And in verse 43, and then chapter 43, and then I'm jumping down to verse 28. I'll go to 26. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the present which was in their hand into the house, and bowed themselves to him into the earth, and asked him of their welfare. And he said, Is your father well? The old man of whom you spake, is he yet alive? And they answered, Thy servant, our father, is in good health. He is yet alive. And they bowed down their heads in obeisance. Again, they bow down to him again. Interesting, they said, We'll never do it. They've already done it twice. They're going to do it again. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your younger brother of whom you spake unto me? And he said, God be gracious unto thee, my son. And Joseph made haste, for his bowels did yearn upon his brother, and he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber and wept there. Can you imagine that reunion? I'm not seeing your younger brother all these years, for over 13 years. Really more than that, 13. I had another 7 of famine. I had 2 more years on top of that. So I had on top of all of that, not seeing this younger brother. And the first time to lay eyes on him, to see him again. The emotion that he was expressing here. And trying to hide his emotions, of course, from these guys. And it says in verse 31, he washed his face and went out and refrained himself and said, set on bread. And they set on for him by himself, and by them for themselves, and for the Egyptians which did eat with him by themselves, because the Egyptians might not eat bread with the Hebrews, for there is an abomination unto the Egyptians. And they sat before him the firstborn. And can you imagine this setting? These brothers are all together, and they're sitting in order. Sitting in order. Can you imagine one of the brothers like, how does he know who's who? How do they know this? you know. But the short of it is, he knew. So now in chapter 44, they go back to Canaan, but are found again with money in their sacks, and also found with what? The cup is in Benjamin's sack, placed there purposely. And Joseph sends his servants after them to go after and purposely do this to get their attention again. And of course, they go and get them in chapter 44 and verse 12. And he searched and began the eldest, and they searched their bags, these Joseph's servants, and left at the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. And then they rent their clothes and laden every man his ass and returned to the city. Can you imagine that to the brothers, what they're experiencing, knowing they got their youngest brother, they promised they would bring him back safely, and now they're having to face this and go back to Egypt all over again. What they're having to face here. And not knowing what they're dealing with, not knowing who they're dealing with. And Judah and his brethren came to Joseph's house, for he was yet there, and they fell before him on the ground again. I put the word again because they did it again. They had to do it again. And Joseph said unto them, what deed is this that ye have done? What? You know not that such a man as I can certainly divine? And going on through that, he talks to them, and he finally has to reveal to them. In chapter 45, then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph, doeth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. Can you imagine that? This guy who's the head, basically close to Pharaoh, being the head guy, he says, I'm your brother, Joseph. And they haven't seen him in all those years at all. What, over 20 some years they haven't seen him. And he says, I'm your brother. He says, how's my father doing? That would be a shocker. I mean, really be a shocker, I would think, to them. In verse 4, and Joseph said unto his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. And they came near and said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in the which shall be neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a prosperity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Again, what do you see there about Joseph? Again, what do you see about him? Anybody?
He's saying it's God's plan. Had no anger towards his brothers for what they did, because he understood that God was in all of this.
Yep.
His brothers.
That's right. He saw it as God's plan for all of this. Some of us would have a tendency to I'm going to get back at you guys, what you did to me. I had the stuff I had to go through. I think it's the mindset of some people. But Joseph did not. And I'm trying to point out to you that Joseph's mindset was, God is in control. God's always been in control. It's always in God's hand, no matter what he's gone through. And even in this, he went through this. And he still points out to his brothers, it's God who's done this for us. What you thought you had done wrong, God worked it out for good. And he did it for a purpose to save your lives, to save the family, and all of this.
And he was in a place of power where he could have done whatever he wanted to with them.
That's true. He could have had them made slaves as well, but he didn't. And you see here in this chat, well, I'm not skipping over this for you, but he hugs their neck, and he's happy to see them, and they're just excited to see his brethren again. Family's important. We all realize that. Family is important. We should realize that. Yes, Sister Irby.
This really reminds us how important it is for all of us to realize that the things that we go through are not about us.
That's right.
But God is putting his plan perfectly together. If we could just believe him, trust him,
Right.
Through it all.
Yeah, it is.
Give him the glory for it.
And there's things that happen, we have no comprehension why it happened, don't understand why. Brother Tom.
The opposite of that is in chapter 42, the brothers said, because of what we did, this has come upon us. When you don't have that faith, then again, I don't want to get ahead of you.
No, it's fine.
That reunion takes place. They're terrified
Yep.
And then again, after father dies, they go to him and say, Dad said this because
We'll get there.
trusting God.
Yeah, and I was going to get there.
That's our option, one of the two. Either we're going to trust God through our circumstances and be like Joseph, or we're going to be like his brothers.
Yeah. And you see how weak in faith they really are. A lot of them are. Yep. I'm not going to read all this to you, but you see this about here about Joseph was being sold into Egypt, the following distressing years of famine and the resulting visits by his brothers in search of food and all this. But God worked it all out together. That's the key. It was God's plan, how this all came together. In verse, and down here, this last part of this, that you see this quote here, well, it was no doubt difficult at the time to see the good in this respective developments, but God saw them working together to bring about his plan for Israel. It was all in God's plan how he wanted for Israel. So the short of it is, I'm going to jump over this slide here, but the short of it is they go get and bring their father back and help. And Pharaoh hears about this. Pharaoh finds out about this in chapter 45 and verse 16. And the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come, and it pleased Pharaoh well and his servants. Can you imagine that in Pharaoh's house? They're hearing about these are his brothers. This is his family has come here after all this time. And they all knew who Joseph was, that he was not an Egyptian. I mean, the Egyptians knew that. And they go on and Pharaoh in verse 17, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, say unto thy brethren, this do ye, lade up your beasts and go, get you unto the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come unto me, and I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat of the fat of the land. Now thou art commanded, this do ye, take ye wagons out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and your children and come. And also regard not your stuff, for the good of all the land of Egypt is yours. Interesting how Pharaoh reaches out. Hey, he's going to help transport you. And that's what he does. He helps transporting. Provide everything they needed to get them there. And don't worry about stuff you got back home. Just come here and we'll take care of everything you need. We'll take care of you. And that's what Pharaoh does. Of course, this is a different Pharaoh here that you'll see in Exodus later on. We'll talk about later. It's a different type of Pharaoh and all that later. But here this Pharaoh says, welcoming ours, is welcoming Israel, Jacob and all them into his land, and said, we're going to do what? We're going to give you the best of the land here. Because your son, your brother, has done great for us, really. He's done an outstanding job. I'm shortening it up for you. So they do come, and if you have seen my notes here. So they travel back in chapter, let me get my notes here. So in chapter 46, Israel comes. He says in chapter 46, it says, and Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifice unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. And I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. Interesting promise here that God said. God said he would do what? He would make them a great nation. Now, he's living in Canaan, and he's got his sons and their wives and their children. Okay, so there's got like 10 sons there, and their wives and their children. When he goes down to Egypt, you know how many people go down there? 70, right? That's verse, what was that verse? Chapter 46, verse 26. And all the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins, besides Jacob's sons' wives, all the souls were 76 here, listed here. 66. And the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2 souls. Also the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70 here. I'm sorry, 70. I said 20. 70 were 10. He counts them. So here's only 70 people who are part of this house of Israel here. Okay? But God says, you're going to be a great nation. And what's going to happen over time, they're going to stay there, of course, be there as well. Oh, I skipped over the blessing. This blessing here that goes on, in chapter 48. Well, chapter 47, Joseph came and told Pharaoh, chapter 47, verse 1. And Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brethren and the flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan. And behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And of course, this is where Israel gets to meet, chapter 7, go down verse 7. And Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Jacob, how old art thou? I wonder if it's interesting to see that how he probably looks at, how old are you? You know. And Pharaoh said, and verse 9, and Jacob said unto Pharaoh, chapter 47, verse 9, and Jacob said unto Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. So Joseph's excited. I'm pretty sure excitement here. That his family's come, his brothers are here, his father's here. He gets to see him. All of them there, and they're giving the best land. They're told to call themselves shepherds because the Egyptians don't like shepherds. And so they're given the best land in Goshen to go live there. So in chapter 48, this blessing that takes place here, the blessing that Jacob gives to the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, that's given here. Manasseh, of course, is the older of the two. And what you see here in this little illustration shows here. So nearing the end of Jacob's life, I'm reading off this bullet here that you see here, the slide. He bestows his blessing on two of his grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's son, as recorded in chapter 48. The two were later become heads of tribes for Israel. The note here I want you to see is that there was a need for this. If the total number of tribes was to be 12, because God had in mind to employ the descendants of Levi as priests for the tribes, the chapter shows that Jacob's now formally adopted Ephraim and Manasseh as two more sons, thus to have parallel rights of inheritance along with his direct sons. So here's two nephews who are also kind of treated like brothers like the others, given the blessings. But here's interesting, this whole chapter is about the blessing upon these two brothers who are the descendants of Joseph, of course, the grandsons. If you look in verse chapter 48 and verse 14. Joseph brings in his two sons, and then chapter 48 and verse 13. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand, toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Ephraim in his right hand, and brought them near unto him. Manasseh is the oldest, so Manasseh should be what? He should be the one who would have the right hand placed on him. But in what you see here, Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it upon Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's, and guiding his hand wittingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph, and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads and let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, and it displeased him, and he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head unto Manasseh's head. And Joseph said unto his father, not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Put thy right hand upon his head. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. And he also shall become a great people. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. And he blessed them that day, saying, in thee shall all Israel bless, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. And Israel said unto Joseph, behold, I die, but God shall be with you and bring you again into the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow. I don't know how well you can see that illustration, but he crosses his hands over to bless the two grandsons. And that's the way the blessing was supposed to be for them. The next chapter goes in. We'll get this through quickly. I'm running out of time. Joseph blesses the rest of his sons, all his sons there, in chapter 49, all of them. And each one of these blessings he gives to each son, he calls them out by name. He calls out the blessing for them, and they're prophecies about their lives. That's what's take place. Who is the oldest of the sons? Reuben. But who gets the greater blessing? Anybody know? Judah gets the greatest blessing of all this, because through Judah is where David comes from, and from David eventually comes the Lord Jesus Christ, comes into this world, of course, through that lineage right there. In chapter 49, as you see up there as well, chapter 49, verses 1 through 2, I got here. And Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, and I will that I may tell you that what you shall befall you in the last days. And gather yourselves together, and hear, you sons of Jacob, hearken unto Israel your father." Interesting that he knows he's getting older and he's getting ready to pass away. But he wants to make sure he blesses his sons. They've been with him all these years. But now it gets to the end, he puts his blessing on them about a prophecy that for each one of their lives to take place. In chapter 49 and verse 33, and Jacob had made, and when Jacob had made an end of commanding his sons, he gathered up his feet into the bed, it yielded up the ghost, and was gathered unto his people. You ever thought about that? When you go to bed at night, last time you put your feet in the bed, you may not wake up the next morning. You may not. But he knew that he was ready to meet the Lord. He knew that. He was ready to go. Just like this person you said, 57, didn't even know. I have a heart attack right there. Key is to know that you're ready to meet the Lord. To know that. Down in chapter 50, zip through this real quick for you. Oh, I forgot to tell you earlier that Joseph had made a promise to his dad. One thing was to bury him in Canaan. And he made the promise. He upheld the promise. And there was a great display of taking the body of Jacob back to Canaan and burying him in the same cave where the other fathers were buried there. Interesting, Tom brought this out, and this is where I was trying to get to eventually, about in chapter 50, and I'm going to sum this up for you. I'm running out of time. In chapter 50, verse 19 and 21, the brothers were worried now that dad is gone, and now what are we going to do? We're with our brother who's the head of this place. He might get rid of us now. But he didn't. He reassured them again in chapter 20, and as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good to bring to pass as it this day to save much people. Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones, and be comforted, and spake kindly unto them. Again, continually taking care of his family. I got a couple of slides here. I'm trying to zip through them as fast as I can. First part is about Isaac. Often the children of great men are not recognized for their greatness because they are so easily compared to the strength of their fathers. Perhaps that is the one reason few Christians seem to recognize the greatness of Isaac. Isaac was one of the great fathers as well of the lineage here. I'm going to move on here quickly. Jacob. We know about Jacob, a lot about his story, about his life, how he did things that he shouldn't have done, but he did them. But God worked it all out to be what he wanted to be, as you see here. The last one, I got one more after this slide here. The one is life of Joseph. We just went through the life of Joseph here quickly for you. But I want you to see there, by faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandments concerning his bones. When he was getting ready to die, Joseph told his family, when you leave, take my bones out of this country and take them back to Canaan. That was a prophecy to take place eventually. Interesting, they didn't do it like they did Jacob. He was there in Egypt, and not until many years later, when the Exodus, when they take the bones of Joseph out of the country. One last slide I want to get to. This one. The opening books of the Bible contain very much more than inspired history of events that happened thousands of years ago. They are filled with and I couldn't say this word. I tried to say this word a couple of times, but the short of it is it means foreshadows, is what it means. Illustrations of the great doctrines of faith, which are the set forth categorically in the New Testament epistles. And I wanted to see this from Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for what? Our learning. All these things were written for our learning, not to be just disregarded. That's what I'm trying to point out. I think that's the first bell. I'm running out of time. Anybody have any comments, any questions real quickly? Okay, the plan is revival meetings next Sunday with Brother Harper. Of course, Lord willing, we're going to go to another chapter and another lesson. What chapter are we going to? What book of the Bible are we going to? Exodus. We're finally getting out of Genesis. Okay, we're going to Exodus, Lord willing, after the revival meeting. That's our plan. And then we'll go into lesson chapter 5 of our lesson book. We'll see how far that takes us there. I was already asked what I was going to do after this whole series, but we don't know when this series is going to end here. Any comments, any questions? Finally got through this. All right, hopefully you're learning something. Hopefully it's helping you to learn some things. Let's go, Lord, and pray. We'll be dismissed. Thank you, Lord, for your kindness. Thank you for your word. There's such a wealth of information and wealth of things to learn from these great people that you in the scriptures here, Lord. Help us, Lord, to learn the things that would help us in our lives, to realize the focus is on you, Lord, that you are honored, your glory. Bless our pastor this morning. Bless the bus ministries and the children's ministries, all the ministries this morning. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen.